Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming to this event, as I mentioned earlier, hosted by Oxford Brookes University with Mary Jean Chan and Sylvia Legris, where we are celebrating the UK launch of Sylvia's positively glowing in my study window light, Garden Physic. You can see this incredible cover here designed by David Pearson. We'll have readings tonight from Mary Jean Chan and Sylvia Legris. And to begin, I'll give a short to medium introduction on both of the books and the poets. First of all, I'd like to thank Niall and Mary Jean for making the space available to us this evening to share this work and read these poems, and hopefully have a discussion and a conversation at the end of the readings. We will be taking questions from the audience also, so if there's anything you'd like to ask either Sylvia or Mary Jean, just put it in the chat when the reading finishes or over the course of the reading if you feel like you may forget, and I can make a note of it and put those questions to Sylvia and Mary Jean when the questions open. So the incredible Garden Physic, which was published just under 2 weeks ago in the UK, has been described by the Guardian as having a vegetal music with a sharp cerebral edge that combines Gerard Manley Hopkins' radical spellbinding rhythm and Marianne Moore's satirical wit. It's serious, brainy, and cardiovascular. Garden Physic is a cutting-edge ode to plants, teeming with human knowledge and natural mystery, accompanied by gem-like illustrations by the poet. I have adored Sylvia's fleshy, material, networked poetry for a very long time. I first published her in Granta magazine 5 years ago. I wrote the 3rd chapter of my PhD on the entirety of Sylvia Legris' work. So it's a dream and an honor to publish this extraordinary collection that felt like exactly what I needed to read and live in for the past, few years, as long as I've known this book. It is often said that nobody writes like her. She has a completely unique, irreverent, idiosyncratic, crafted, masterful poetic, and there's so much to find in her networked and accumulative lyric mode. These poems in particular enter the absolute interior of the plant alongside the interior of other bodies that surround those plants to create this kind of irreverent symbiosis between the things that occur and live all around us. They're playful, exuberant, bombastic, joyful. They are gems of poems to cherish, but they're deeply serious in their pursuit of all the things that we require to make us feel nurtured, safe, growing, and green. Mary Jean's incredible first collection, Flèche, is an extraordinary book which similarly concerns itself with what is bodily. It's an extraordinary document on queerness and human boundaries, geographic, romantic, familial, how we grapple with loves, the loves that we choose and the loves that we're given. Mary Jean is working on lots of new poems at the moment, which I know will be extraordinary. And we have a few upcoming in Granta, so we've got those poems to look forward to as well from Mary Jean's new work. Mary Jean will be reading for us first this evening, and then Sylvia will follow them after that. So I'll hand over to you both, mute and shut myself off, and look forward to hearing you both read.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks everyone for coming. It's a real honor to be sharing the virtual stage with Sylvia, whose work I really love, and I'm so excited to see the book in its sort of physical form. I have yet to get my physical copy, but I have the PDF, and I urge you all to buy the book. It's extraordinary. I'll read a few poems from Flèche, and then I'll read some newer poems. It feels like it's the right time to sort of reading newer work because it's spring, and it feels like I've kind of inadvertently picked some poetry from my newer manuscript that has plants in it, maybe perhaps in response to Sylvia's work. So I'll start with a few poems from Flèche. Practice. As a teenager, Fencing was the closest thing I knew to desire. All the girls swapping one uniform for another before practice, their white dresses replaced by breeches. I thought we were princes in a fairy tale with a twist, since there were no princesses to be taken, wed. As knights, we were told to aim for an imaginary spot just above our opponent's left breast. Often, I left a bruise, the blade's tip ricocheting off chest guards onto skin. Just as often, I would feel yellow blooms of ache where the girl I thought was beautiful had pierced my heart. Hours later, I would transform. I would head back home with a deepening sense of dread, my bruises fading to quiet. They would have all that. To sing the evening home, she prepares a pot of lentil stew, her phone radiant with messages, imagining her lover's steady hand gripping her smartphone to navigate towards some notion of home, their flat a familiar place of worship, their bodies growing close and moving apart with the regularity of heartbeat, hot breath. There the lover is, running to catch a bus, wondering at her lover's motions throughout the flat, how her feet must press on the floor with each step, how the orchid must have stretched itself a few millimeters overnight, how the stew must be whispering on the stove and the table laid for dinner. They are gentler because they have memorized each other's fears like daily prayer, how too much salt brings back the years of loneliness, how a bath may be more necessary than a rough kiss after a day's drought of tenderness. They are gentler because they have grown too knowledgeable to love any other way. How have I hurt you? Such asking becomes routine, almost like walking down the aisle of a supermarket at evening, but it is what they do best. Beyond desire, two clasped bodies holding the heart's ache at bay. And I'll end the poems from Flèche with this final third poem. This is the newest poem that was added to the book when I was completing the manuscript. And it felt in some ways like a transitional poem, a poem that was edging towards something newer, but it still fit within the narrative that Flèche was inhabiting. So I included it in the final draft. Wish. I would like to live like the trees. My lover often says, look up, as she admires a canopy of green. Her tree-like behavior astounds me. If you looked within me now, you'd see that my languages are like roots, gnarled in soil, one and indivisible, except the world divides me endlessly. Some days I dare not look at the trees. They are such hopeful creatures. If the legislators of our world look to their trees for guidance, would they reconsider everything? Lately, I've been trying to write a poem that might birth a tree. A genuine acceptance of the self continues to elude me. So the next poems I'll be reading are from sort of a new manuscript, and it's tentatively titled Bright Fear. And I wrote this in the wake of the 2 lockdowns in the UK. 2020 was a time when I couldn't write. I found language very difficult, but instead began writing these sort of lyric essays. And one of them I'd sort of edited to form 2 poems that are interlinked. And for me, I think COVID was something that came up a lot for me in my own thinking and my work, because I lived through SARS in Hong Kong in 2003. And so these 2 poems are about that. London, 2020. During the early days of the pandemic, she asked herself if language meant anything, when it was so clearly the body that faced an existential threat. Keep going, she told her body. One day, she began losing blood. Her period lasted for 30 days. It was the month lockdown ended in the UK, when people flew off on European holidays. Stress, her father once told her, can make you ill. It can make your hair turn white. She looked in the mirror that evening and saw many silvery strands sprouting, like dandelions. The worst thing about this, she confessed to her partner as they lay in bed, is that other people, no matter how much I love them, are potential hosts. Each night, she would dream about being in a large room full of people, then realize that everyone was unmasked. In the dream, bodies became repugnant. It was in 2003 when she first learned that unseen droplets breathed gently into air could kill. They called it SARS. As a teenager, she learned this English term alongside other words, like sacrifice, sacred, scared. Hong Kong, 2003. At 13, school meant mandatory medical kits, 2 face masks, a small bottle of hand sanitizer. We sang hymns praising the Lord through our masks, standing far apart from one another, empty seats filling the hall. My father left for work in an N95, returned home late with its firm outline on his pale cheeks. Each day, I waited for him to come back, felt his forehead, listened for a cough, washed my hands till they became gnarled like bark. This next poem is a specular poem. So for those of you familiar with the form, it reads back to front. And so there are 2 parts to the poem. Hindsight. All the ingredients necessary for happiness. I grew up well fed, years away from conflict and its aftermath. When someone in the family knows sacrifice as the only currency, such knowledge seeps. History must suffice. My mother knew hunger. Bread, in the absence of a miracle, cannot yield more loaves. I will give myself the mango stone, save the sweet flesh for someone else. Save the sweet flesh for someone else. I will give myself the mango stone. A miracle cannot yield more loaves. My mother knew hunger. Bread, in the absence of history, must suffice. Such knowledge seeps, sacrifice as the only currency when someone in the family knows conflict and its aftermath. I grew up well fed, years away from all the ingredients necessary for happiness. This next poem is a poem I wrote in response to, partly in response to the book called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, which some of you might have already read. I just found it such an amazing manifesto and also a very lyrically written book by a poet who was able to crystallize things about race that I hadn't sort of been able to formulate myself. And this was a sort of partial response to reading that amazing book. Fully human. In a room of my own, I ponder the meaning of silence. Being silenced is new for some, but not for others. Ask the queer child. Ask her what she knows about quiet and the intimate knowledge of a fire alarm going off that only she can hear, that no one will believe existed. She leaves for another country, exiles herself from the familiar, the family, the sea surrounding the fragrant city. Departure was once fleeing, necessary, fraught. Try living in the romanticized elsewhere. The sensation of being watched is daily and casual. Try feeling unsafe on public transport. Try being seated at the same table as the esteemed scholar in All Souls, who insists on sharing his expertise, how the British brought culture, language, the law. He smiles. Her most clipped diction fills the one lull as he refills his wine glass. She can tell he has enjoyed their chat, that he wants to continue devouring the most pleasant sight of her acquiescence. to be a diverse thing in a country that won't see you as fully human. Are you listening? I have paid that price, knowing that nowhere is entirely safe from harm, racialized and queer as I am. Answer. At the Poetry Cafe, someone sipping tea once stared at me from across the room and asked, "Are you a man or a woman? I want to know." I got up, moved my laptop, book, and coffee. I eventually replied, "I would prefer not to answer that. Excuse me." In deep autumn, on a busy London sidewalk, I want to summon myself to be free. Calling Home, after Anne Carson. While talking to your mother, you keep your fingers busy, your mind elsewhere. Her voice flows through your soul like air. You steady your voice, but she knows to ask about the tightness in your throat. After all that has happened, have you finally forgiven each other? The child asks, how long will it feel like burning? Your mother wants to know what you had for lunch, tells you what she ate for dinner. This mutual exchange of images. You ask her to turn on her camera so you can see her, knowing she will refuse. Another day, she says. How to tell her that after decades on Earth, you should be able to know each other, that what children want is for their parents to see them as they already are. Instead, you are sent photos of yourself, an 8-year-old in a beige dress at a wedding, an awkward teenager dressed for the opera in Milan on your first trip to Europe. How to tell her none of those versions fit anymore. Your partner walks into the room. You are reminded that you cannot change those you love most. Your voice blew in the violet hour. And I will read 3 more poems to conclude my part of the evening. Eden. In the penultimate scene where mother and child are listening to one another, speak in spite of everything, the way an orchestra might play on bravely, even when the audience claps before its time, you will want to stay a while in subtropical winter heat. As sunlight blazes through the fog of memory, you begin to wonder if the origin story can at last be transfigured into the version redacted through the centuries, the one in which the garden comes alive, a queer child's vision of paradise, where the trees are free to bear their multitudinous light. This penultimate poem is called Ars Poetica, and when I was writing poems for the new manuscript, I was thinking a lot to myself about, what the function of poetry was, especially during a global crisis. And a lot of poets have, of course, explored this topic. But I ended up writing my first ever poetry sequence. So there are actually 16 poems in this sequence, all titled Ars Poetica. And this is the final poem in that sequence. Ars Poetica. As a child, I considered often the impact that falling in love with English had on my mother's happiness. She once said, "Don't think you can talk back to me in a colonial language. It isn't superior." I can't describe her voice. When she speaks in Shanghainese, it is sweet like water. Her language came to me as in a familiar dream, a lotus flower sinking into myself and blooming. During my first month in England, I learned the art and science of speaking to reassure. How else can I survive? It's so easy to be ashamed. I am asked why my poems are so clear. I'll confess, it's what happens when you want to be understood. 10 years ago, I found myself in Nice and learned to dream in French, my mother's first foreign tongue. That summer, the sea was also my mother. The Bay of Angels held me in its polyphony, and I chose all my loves, Cantonese, English, Mandarin, French, spoke with a satisfaction I had not felt in years, saw my relationship to the world through sounds again, till I was reconciled, the way rainbows exist in rain. And I will conclude with this poem that was very lucky to find a home in Granta. And so thank you, Rachael, for publishing this poem. Out. Can I be myself now? I asked my parents in a dream. There is a long silence that lasts for years, punctuated by half-finished sentences. This is how it is with family. One day, my mother said to me on the phone, "We are one body, you know that, right?" She meant me, my father, and her. To disagree was to admit to my desire for cruelty, this severance that has allowed me to chisel a way out. Yesterday, as we spoke, my parents looked at me and simply said, "Yes." "Yes?" I asked. "Yes," they replied. "We love you." The sentence was complete, no longer half finished. The months ahead of me are wide open. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jean. That was really, really wonderful. Really, really special reading. I'll just hop on to say that Sylvia will be reading next.
Thank you, Rachael. Is it on me? I can't tell. That was terrific, Mary Jean, and what an honor it is to be reading with you, and both you and Rachael, like these brilliant young poets. It's just astounding, and I feel so just honored and fortunate to well, be publishing anything, but to have this book out with Granta, and Rachael has been such a friend and a supporter of my work, and it's remarkable. I mean, everybody should have a Rachael Allen, on their side. It makes such a difference. And thank you, Neil Monroe and Mary Jean, for inviting me to read at Oxford Brookes, and I don't know what else to say. I'll show the cover again, designed, hand-drawn by David Pearson, which is astounding. And look at this. It's like the Peep Show cover. Isn't that lovely? And thank you to everybody at Granta Books as well. If there's one thing I've had to kind of figure out how to do during the pandemic, it's reading sitting down. Like, I'm such a standing reader, and I tend to kind of move my hands around a lot, and it's hard to contain that in a chair in front of a computer screen. So I thought I would read sort of from a longish poem, which is in 10 parts, and I'm going to read the first 7 parts because usually I don't have enough time to read a sustained sequence like this. So I thought I would do that. Sorry for my fidgeting. I'll get it out of the way before I read. And I should say, I am eagerly waiting for spring here. I imagine there are flowers probably blooming in England, and it snowed here all day. For those of you who don't know, I'm in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in Western Canada, and parts of our province has had record blizzards this past week, and we've been spared, but it's been chilly, and we've had a lot of snow falling, and the sun is out today. It's actually just after noon here. the garden body, a florilegium. A pepper of bees opens the pupils. Chorus aphrodisia, mariner's root, bright sky and night star, heavenly, rainbow, amethyst, azure, blue, flower de luce, flowering ring. White arch angelic, the bee nettle, the dead nettle, a hide of nettle cloth, of finely nerved sedge. Take heed the edges, the pipes, the passages, the petal corridor, the corolla tube. A blossom is a throat, rose oil and hip. A ripped rose is a voice organ, time cut and curt, royally red and confidence keeping, redder than Mars, redder than hot days and parched Venus on the lips. Muscle rose, flesh rose, then rustling red shank rose. Vines ascend the arch of aorta, mercurial, the climbing nightshade, the bundle branched bittersweet. White spotted hellebore under Jupiter and wind, oak lungs, jovial lungs. Sea rush blows the lungs with sweet rose, carmine and sanguine, flaming red. Candleberry fires the blood. Red is antispasmodic, cardiovascular, great garden patience of Mars. May blossom, hawthorn, spring gushes red veined with sorrel, bloodwort, blow Jupiter, red dock for longevity. Venus stokes the throatwort, the good leaf, the rose noble. L'herbe du siège slackens, the isthmus of the fauces, gash red and choking rose. Double tongue, bay laurel, Daphne of the sun. Yarrow charms wasps, snuffs the inveterate headache. Daphne sings the bees from the ears. The voice reeds are a Queen Anne's lace of wasps. Mercury abounds with buzz and wild carrot, jumpstart speech with horse-strange words, a gargle of hogsfettle and brimstone wort. Under Leo, composure, herb of grace, anti-magical, vinegar of the four thieves, poison against poison, rue before regret. Touch wood ruta sets the garden free. Lightning sulfur, the garden prone to primrose and paroxysm, pellitory of the wall quells, old hacking, an old cough, a new moon courtesy of wild clary, eye bright, clear eye on toute bonne foi. Sweep away the broom, the burdock, the beastly antipathy between ash tree and adder, snakeweed, dragon's blood, devil's bit, serpent's tongue, wickedness, a weak moon, licked and licked and licked. What a commotion. Wild rocket, a racket, a wake robin, cuckoo point, the clear caroling rise and fall. Volatile dog's mercury, dog's grass, dog rose, hot, fits and cold, metallic blue, the indecisive indigo. So the garden bellyaches, so what, the gripes, rose rife with tormentil, gallant herb of the sun, 5 fingers, flesh and blood, stamina, life's long thread, root red, the unhindered heart. Leaves respire and rain returns blood-veined and blood-dock, blood-colored juices, red poppy, a headache, heartichoke, the downhearted, loose strife calms the fugitive scarlet, sweet slumber, the fleshy rootstock. Enlist imagination under the banner of science. Flora attired by the elements, sea lavender, sea holly, sundrops, Jacob's ladder reaching ether, wind rose, sun rose, watergrass, the loves of the plants, the economy of vegetation, root, pith, lobes, plume, calyx, coral, sap. Air distributes the seeds of names, windflower, digitalis, tipsy, and ethereal, trade winds, vital light, seeds within seeds. Start from the soil and win their airy way. The 50-seated heart's delight, saturnine and doting wild, heart's ease, herb constancy, ponce, an opening, call me to you, kiss her in the buttery, meet me in the entry. The yard wants what the yard wants, bloom of Ruth, breath of life, blush, charisma, compassion, imagination, ebb tide and nostalgia, ground cover and climbers, floribunda, abundance, a hybrid of bruise and steep, petal and drag, lungfuls of lamp flower, rose campion, rose of heaven, the moon shoulders, rose root, rosy colored stone crop, the neck laced with French rose, common rose, pomander of roses. At the center of the garden, the heart, red as any rose, pulsing, balloon vine, love in a puff, heart seed, heart of the earth, a continuous flow of red. So I did an event online in the UK just a week ago, and I didn't want to repeat what I'd read then, but as I have a bit more time to read in this one, and Rachael wasn't there for that event, so I thought I would read this poem. It's called Flowers of Brass. I think I've just dripped water on my book. This first poem about the last book is where the garden begins. Sand and prolific dust, metals and earth. Earth like small coals from a pitch tree, burnt red earth, big veined, bituminous earth. Supreme earth has the disposition of medicine, earth that cools the pores, earth that closes cuts and heals sores, earth's capable of absorbing acids, earth's aluminous with spores. The forgotten earths, the excavated, the earths of bones and horns. Animals and earth, vegetables and earth, geodes, whetstone, soot and earth. Pharmacy begins in plants. Plants are the flesh of the gods. In the kingdoms of nature, the final authority is earth. The virtues of earth are the virtues of guts, gall, metallurgy, and nerve. Earth's showy and not showy, earth's sapid and insipid, earth that tastes of copper and zinc, earth as bland as coral and chalk. So sits the garden in vegetable pride, plotted in graphite and plumbago, strange metals and stranger flowers, gold salts and leadwort, frothy silver. A garden of Cyprian earth fired in kilns, a garden of white lead scraped and pounded, flowers of cadmium from red hot brass, of brass burnt from the nails of ships. Silver slag, iron slag, lead slag, petals and leaves spit from earth, seeds of metallic scales, scales like glittering millet, brass in the pitch of thundering Zeus, brass in the scale of a Delphic hymn. Flowers inscribed on stone, flowers in a single melodic line, alloy shavings, the brassy chaff, flowers of chutzpah and cheek. The yard is a measure of several millennia, a yard of stars and amalgams, a yard of gramagrass and asters, day's eyes and damned yellow composites, petals that open at dawn and close at dusk. Flowers with conspicuous bracts, grasses circled by hair, spikelets housing tiny flowers, florets of malleable elements, needlegrass, saltgrass, alkali grass, a choir of mallet grass, rye, the wild rye. So to finish, I should have mentioned before that poem that the last section of Garden Physic functions as a book within a book, and it's after Pedanius Dioscorides' Materia Medica, and it has its own title page and table of contents and dedication. And it has a series of appendices, one of which is a long list of names of plants that are organized in rather idiosyncratic categories. So I thought I'd read a few because they're kind of fun, and I'm not going to read them all, but I'll just do it off the cuff. So this is from Anatomy and Afflictions. Abscess root, acheweed, arse smart, birthwort, bladder fucus, bladder herb, bladder senna, bladder rack, blister plant, bloodwort, cough wort, eyebright, feverberry, feverfew, common feverfew, corn feverfew, sea feverfew, bloody fingers, lady's fingers, dead man's fingers, 5 fingers grass, goatweed, hand flower, heartwort, heart mint, heart of the earth, heart trefoil, kidney-leaved sourweed, kidney vetch, kidney wort, knit bone, liver balsam, liverweed, liverwort, noble liverwort, lung moss, oak lungs, lungwort, navel wort, nipple wart, nosebleed, palsy wart, paralysis, piss abed, prick, madam, ribwort, plantain ribwort, sanguinaria, common garden scurvy grass, sciatica grass, sciatica cress, skeleton weed, sneezewort, spleenwort, common spleenwort, sweat root, throatwort, tongue grass, double tongue, warty spurge, with wind, woundwort. And I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was absolutely extraordinary. And I'd never seen you read before, so that was such a huge, special, what felt like a very private gift, but obviously it's to lots of people, but that was a really, really extraordinary, bodily, humorous, deeply thought. I felt like I was in the root and in the soil and in the plant. The way that you are able to kind of graft a self into language and graft the language of plants into a kind of idea of a self. And you do this with so many other kind of beings and bodies in your poetry. Just completely astounds me every time I hear it. You have a way in language and etymology and sound that just seems to expand ever outwards like a ripple effect, like a stone dropped in water or something. It's absolutely endless what you're able to do with sound and play. It's just amazing. And Mary Jean, your reading was so incredibly moving and raw and similarly deftly contained, and the way that you've been able to sort of speak so honestly and gracefully to our present moment with a previous experience felt like a way I've not read the pandemic before, or how we're managing this moment. So thank you for just always giving us a poetic that feels incredibly vulnerable and brave and insightful. Like it touches on the moment in time, but it's also touching on a very sort of specific idea of a self. I feel hugely lucky to have heard you both read together tonight. Absolutely amazing. We are going to have a little bit of a Q&A, a little bit of a chat between us. So if anybody has questions, please pop them in the Q&A or put them in the chat box. I can see both. And we already have a question here from the amazing Gary Barwin. who, if it's the same Gary Bartman as who I think it is a wonderful Canadian poet who I've also published on Granta. So hello, Gary. This poem is just for Sylvia. And perhaps we'll start with that one before I move into some of my own questions as well. Gary says, it seems like names, words are organisms to you, Sylvia, like plants in the garden of the poem. How do you conceive of all the sound relations and formal relations, e.g. repetition, and I would add to that kind of rhyme, an internal rhyme, between these lexical green things? If that's not too big of a question. It's a wonderful question.
That's a hard question. Hi, Gary. I know Gary's work, and I've met him actually in Toronto at a festival or something. So this question is largely about sound. Like I know Gary's a musician.
Yeah, sound relations. How do you conceive of the sound relations and formal relations, e.g. repetition?
Yeah, well, it's in part through repetition myself. When I read, it feels almost more like it does really feel very much like an act of composition, and it feels often like musical composition as opposed to just using the words. And when I'm writing, it's I've said this before, it's like the words and the music of the words kind of unfold sort of in almost like in shifting parallel to each other. And I read from the very first word that I put down on a page, which may end up being expunged later on. I read every single word out loud, and rather obsessively, and to hear it. And it's the only way that I can. And with each new word, as I build on a poem, I'm reading them out loud, and it's such a weird thing and such a weird process, and kind of impossible to describe, because I don't really know myself entirely what happens. It feels kind of mysterious and magical, if that doesn't sound sort of too kind of precious and pretentious. But it's very intuitive, and it's trying to find the word that will convey the meaning that I want in a particular line, say, and then getting it to fit sort of orally, A-U-R-A-L, orally, and just listening to it. And so it does feel very much like I feel like I'm kind of putting more emphasis on the ear often when I'm writing than the eye and the language itself. But it is often very intuitive, and just trusting my own gut about that. And I don't, I've always listened to a lot of music, and I studied music for a time as a kid, but didn't continue. But I often feel like all of my musical sensibilities I've now kind of put into my poetry, and often the poems, they do almost feel, especially some of the shorter ones, they feel almost like little songs, like I'm singing them. And it's kind of, I have to get that feeling. I know that something's working when I feel almost on a visceral level that this feels kind of like I'm singing. So that's kind of a long answer. I'm trying to keep my answers short, and it's not working. But does that answer Gary's question? I don't know.
I think that's I think it's a really, really interesting thing to think about in your poems. And I was thinking about a line in Pneumatic Antiphonal, which is a pamphlet that Sylvia published before Garden Physic, where the phrase, or something along the lines, there's a run of words that are sparrow, narrow, arrow, and sagittal. And I think about your poems like a kind of a playful echo. It's like you throw the word out and see what kind of aural association is going to come back, and the words kind of hold those sound similarities within them, and that's what sort of expands out of the poem. It's not just a linear or representative meaning, it has a sound sense, it chimes, which is where the music sits. For me, it feels etymological as well, the kind of sound sense.
Yeah, and the etymology, as you know, that's for me is a really important part of how I write is looking at the histories of words and how they've evolved through time. And that's something that we might use now has a very different meaning than it might have had 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. But for me, it kind of carries that inside of it. And a reader may not be aware of that, but I kind of feel like it has that sort of vibration around it or those echoes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you, Gary, for that question. I'm going to ask one, and then we have another question as well that's just come in, because I wanted to maybe think about both of your involvement of other texts and research in your writing. Mary Jean, you mentioned a poem in response to Kathy Park Hong, who's an incredible poet and essayist. And I know that you, Sylvia, involve various external texts in your books. You mentioned briefly De Materia Medica, which is this ancient Roman pharmacopoeia of botanical plants that you've sort of indirectly played with and rewritten and reframed and repurposed. And I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about what research means to your poetry. Sylvia, I was reminded of a note today that you made in an interview where you said something like 4 years of work, lines of poetry, which feels very true to my experience. But I would love to hear what you both have to say about the involvement of other texts and research as well.
I'll jump in to just quickly respond to that. I think with the second book in particular, I just found, as I mentioned earlier in my reading, that I just didn't have the language for a lot of the things I was feeling in 2020. And it was also the year after my debut had come out. So it was the kind of confluence of a natural, perhaps, writer's block, plus the fact that there were a lot of things happening, which I felt were so immense that I didn't quite know exactly how I thought about, what I thought about it. For example, in trying to think through COVID racism, there were so many things happening there that I couldn't exactly pinpoint what it was that I was, almost trying to grapple with. And I think when I read Minor Feelings, it was such an honest book. Firstly, I think there was someone who said, I wish we had a British version of Minor Feelings, because Kathy is able to talk about, growing up in America and sitting adjacent to what it means to be, Black American, and you're not part of the most marginalized group, but what are you doing that might be complicit? Like how does Asian America sit alongside Black America, for example? And she also talks about art and the role of that in her life. And it was just such a mixture of the different things I was thinking about that I think it just opened up something within me. Sometimes I didn't even have a poem in me, but I just had maybe a sentence or I had a sentiment that I could then work with. And I was just thinking partly about the intersections of queerness and race as well. And I do explore that in my poetry, in my debut collection, but I was also thinking more about how, home for me is a complicated place. Like it's not as if I went home and when that's a slur, go home. It's not as if I went home, everything would be okay again, right? Because that's partly the reason I'm here, is that home wasn't a safe space either. That queerness there made me feel unsafe. And actually, ironically, in the UK, I feel safer in that sense. But there's the racial aspect. And so there are these intersectional issues that sometimes I find difficult to grapple with, even when talking to friends or peers. So I think for me, that particular book was just almost like a friend I could go back to again and again. When I had a query or when I had something that I was trying to figure out, I could, there's some books that become more than just a book. They become a guiding voice. Like I had that with Adrian Rich's Dream of a Common Language, that the object exceeds the kind of the physicality of it and the words in it. It becomes a presence, and I think we had a chat about that, Rachael, during the Faber Poetry podcast, where we were asked to bring in something that was an important object. And that's what I brought in, was the Dream of a Common Language. So I'll end there.
Yeah, I think you have one of the things I love so much about your poetry, Mary Jean, is the way that you play and test boundaries. As I mentioned earlier, you kind of have this sort of it's almost like a flirtation with how you can push a sense of place and what place means what it means to feel at home somewhere. Even when I think about the common conceit in Flèche, and this kind of thinking about fencing, it's such a mannered attempt to play with boundaries and boundarylessness that felt very kind of high tension. You know, there's like a highly wrought tension about the overarching conceit of that book that just fed into the more overtly political and personal work that you were involving in the more lyric poems. Yeah, I just love it. Sorry, I muted you then because I meant to unmute myself. So sorry if I cut you off. Sylvia, did you want to talk a little bit about research and other books?
Yeah, no, I do. You know, it's interesting now because when I think I've always done a fair bit of research as a poet, and I felt like I didn't know a lot of poets who were doing that. So it seems like more are doing it now. And like Lucy Mercer, who I read with last week, and looking at what is it, Andrea Alciato's Book of Emblems, and using other texts. And yeah, for me, it's funny because I do a lot of research, and part of it is, I think, my own insecurity about if I want to write about a particular topic, of not knowing enough about it. So I kind of obsessively go overboard. And I remember that interview, and I said that, I think it was, I think it was actually more than 4 years of research for, like, 9 short lines in a poem. But it always feels like the way that I write, that I always have kind of something to fall back on in terms of other sources, and largely it's driven out of my own curiosity. Like I'm reading and reading one book leads me to something else. I mean, I've said this before, that the Hideous Hidden, I had those gland poems that then kind of reached their feelers out into botany, and that was around the same time that I'd started gardening for the first time in my life. So that was where the obsession came into that, and just reading books about gardening and historical books, and just becoming fascinated by the material and by the language, of course. And when I'm stuck, I always say to myself, go back to your source material, because there's always, I feel like I'm just mining stuff for language that has kind of poetic potential. And unfortunately, sort of years later, I don't think I remember any of that stuff, like when I did Nerve Squall and was reading all that stuff about neurology. But I don't know how much of that information I've retained, but it sort of served its purpose for that book. But yeah, the research is, and it's fun. I mean, it's just kind of fun exploring stuff and seeing where it takes you.
Thank you. We've got 2 final questions that I'm going to put into one, because they are addressed to you, Sylvia, and they sort of leave us in a good space, which is the physical and practical space of the garden. They are from Dawn Watson. Hello, Dawn, who's our next Granta poet, and Simon White. And Dawn says to Sylvia, do you have a garden? Could you speak a bit about it if you do, and what is the importance of it to your broader writing life? And Simon asked a lovely long question, which I won't be able to read the whole thing, but he wanted to know the difference between poems that are written about sort of cultured botanical spaces like the garden and wild spaces, and what's the relationship between the wild and the cultured in your poetry. So a big garden question. What does the garden mean to you personally? What's its important to your writing life? And do you differentiate between what is wild and what is cultivated?
These are such hard questions. I should have said no hard questions. I do have a garden now. I say sort of, sort of like I'm some sort of imposter. I'm like a gardener imposter, because I feel like it's the relationship between the garden and my writing is that I always feel like I'm trying to figure out what I do, because every poem, I feel like I have to figure out it again. And every year, I mean, right now, my so-called garden is buried in snow. So there'll still be a month or so before it's warm enough to actually start planting anything. I haven't been gardening for that long because I lived in apartment buildings, what you would call flats, for many, many years. And so it's only been relatively recently that I've had access to a space to do that in. And I really like it. It's a lot of work, but it does kind of, when I'm writing, it's like my mind is free to sort of think about other things and think about my writing. And so it has that connection in terms of, I've often, for many years, when I've been lucky enough to get grants and funding to do writing, in between times, I've done house cleaning and office cleaning. So it's been like sort of physical work. And it's actually kind of a nice balance to writing because it's not using the writing part of my brain. And gardening is kind of the same thing. It's like it works, it's a nice balance to writing. In terms of cultivated versus wild spaces, it's interesting now, like Mary Jean, the work I'm doing now, I started thinking about it before the pandemic, but the parameters became quite redefined during the pandemic because a lot of it's about sort of local flora and fauna, and a lot of it contains references to wild spaces, or are they even wild? I mean, the kind of what out here we call naturalized spaces, that are spaces that have been reclaimed in some cases from what had been farmland and replanted or cultivated with what were original indigenous plants in those areas. So they kind of straddle this line between wild and cultivated, but I've been going to a lot of kind of conservation sites and looking at plants and animals and insects, and they do feel different, because I think a lot of garden physic, it's because I was looking at ancient or antiquated texts. There were poems that existed, even though they were written about on the page by somebody else a long time ago. They kind of existed more in my imagination. And whereas now I'm actually out taking photos of plants and then looking at them. And the process in some ways feels very similar to garden physic, but I don't think that the actual poems are the same. And they do, I don't know that they feel wilder, but they do feel different. I hope they're different. Does that answer those questions?
I think it will. No, so yeah, they're
great questions. You should ask Mary Jean more questions, though.
Well, what we can do is we can end on we'll actually end on one more for the both of you, just because we're edging up to our time now. But maybe actually we could end on this sort of thinking about what I mentioned earlier, this very sort of evocative sense of place and space, and the idea of boundaries, and also an idea of sort of like histories and timelines that you both employ in your poems and in your books. I think about Sylvia, this sort of mining of work from something like De Materia Medica, and Mary Jean, what must feel like a very sort of difficult, very contemporary history that you're already having to reckon with by managing the SARS crisis in Hong Kong and the pandemic that we're still very much in, although we're being told that we're not. And maybe these ideas of how we sort of poetically and politically transcend these boundaries. For you, Sylvia, boundaries of the garden. Simon then just talking about what's cultivated and what's wild. I also think about the kind of geographical spaces that you span just through talking about plant life that may be found in various places. And obviously yours, Mary Jean, is this more explicit kind of personal journeying through spaces. And that's a kind of more of a comment than a question, unfortunately. But I'm interested in how you think about boundaries between physical and geographical spaces and timelines. And I suppose I'm very interested in particular, Mary Jean, this reckoning that we're all doing with what's happened in the pandemic, but in the poem that you just read this evening feels much closer and much scarier than it has in other writing that I've read.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I think for me, it was interesting trying to write about what we are living through, partly because a lot of it feels like deja vu, a lot of it feels like it's happened before. And in my instance, it has, I suppose, on a smaller scale, and that SARS was about, I think it lasted for 6 to 8 months in Hong Kong, and then it sort of died out. At that point, they were able to contain it. And just a lot of the behaviors, I think, that I have since adopted in the wake of SARS have obviously come to the fore during COVID. And I think it was also interesting when I was thinking about it, because there's so much caught up in those timelines. When I was 13, I was learning English. I was literally learning English, at school, and still having to look things up in the dictionary a lot. And I think I really loved, especially Sylvia, your use of sound and repetition, because I guess I was trying on a very small scale to do that a little bit with certain words like sacrifice, sacred, scared. I mean, for an ESL speaker, these words seem very similar. The spellings are similar, the sounds are similar, but they're kind of slant rhymes, if you will, right? And I think when I was learning these words, they felt very, they felt like echoes of one another. But of course, there's different meanings embedded in there. And of course, we're talking about sacrifice, we're talking about feeling scared. And I just, was trying to look at the English words again through the eyes of my younger self. I have another poem where I talk about the words sword and word are only one letter apart. And that's literally how I learned English. And I think that's quite interesting, that I'm revisiting perhaps a self that, I no longer look at English in such a wide-eyed manner. I suppose I do start to take certain words for granted. But during that time in my life, I didn't. So I think, for me, I suppose I'm still trying to probe my relationship to the English language and in tandem looking at things like SARS and COVID and the language around these pandemics. How do we speak about these things? I remember being asked very early on, this was in 2020, whether, I suppose there's a culture of mask wearing, as in we are culturally predisposed to enjoy wearing masks. And it sort of just really puzzled me, because of course no one likes wearing masks in 30-degree heat. It's just that what we'd been through, that became part of the response that was natural. And what is not natural and what is natural, I think it differs across these contexts. And so I think words like, natural and cultural, and they just become so loaded in these contexts, that I just felt moved to explore that more in my more recent poems. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So can you rephrase the question, Rachel? Are you asking about boundaries and timelines?
Well, I'm sort of interested in the you're working within the incredibly boundaried space of the garden, but within that kind of boundaried space, you sort of transcend timelines and geographies through your explorations of plants that are found geographically, maybe specific gardens here or in Canada or elsewhere. And perhaps this is a question you've maybe already answered, and perhaps it comes back to that sort of more intuitive, mystical space of just what happens. But I am interested in the kind of constraint that you placed upon yourself with this book by operating within the garden. It feels almost like a sort of poetic, formal device. Be working within a constraint.
I mean, it's interesting because it didn't feel like a constraint in writing the poems. I mean, it felt actually like I would say the boundary is more about my imagination and what I can bring into that kind of imaginary garden, because even though I have that kind of silly rendition of the garden outside in here, I didn't really feel like I was writing about that garden. It was more like I was sort of writing this kind of imaginary garden that takes in plants and sources from all different places. And the thing which is wonderful about using historical sources is, and I recognize that, like I said this in a previous reading, that Pedanius Dioscorides' Materia Medica has been transcribed and transliterated and translated by many people many times over. And what I have probably bears little relation to that original text, if it even existed as a text as we would think of one today. But the language, though, is so, it's just so rich, and it's exciting to sort of try to rejuvenate it by taking that old language and kind of plopping it into my context right now. And it seems like you know, in the scientific terms, which I feel like it's kind of opening them up, because often in terms of science, a lot of these areas they and these disciplines, they feel like they're so so esoteric, and so the language is aimed at people who practice in those fields. So by taking it and sort of turning them on their head poetically and musically, it feels like maybe I don't make them accessible in terms of what they actually mean in their original intention, but they feel like I can enter them on that level, you know, which is through the poem and through hearing the poem.
I wrote down in big capital letters, "Enlist imagination under the banner of science," which was from one of the poems that you read.
Which is from Erasmus Darwin, actually, who said that. But it's interesting, and Mary Jean, when they were talking about the pandemic and that they couldn't write at all in 2020, and the beginning of the pandemic, I just felt like, well, one, this kind of sense of paralysis, like and the fear. I mean, now it seems like just like sort of daily kind of sort of low grade fear that we live with all the time. But initially, I mean, they were projecting these numbers, I mean, just in my own province, of how many deaths there would be. And it was really frightening because we didn't know what was happening at that point. And I just felt like, how on earth can I write? I mean, I was so distracted, but it just seemed almost obscene, the idea of trying to write poems when the world is entering the state of crisis. And I probably watched more TV in that first 5 or 6 weeks than I've watched the previous 20 years. But after about that much time, I actually started writing new poems. And it just felt like this is the way that I know how to kind of cope with what's going on in the world. And it just seemed like this is a place that feels that I have some control over what I'm doing, because I think we still feel like we have little control, especially as restrictions are being lifted. And here we aren't getting daily updates at all, so we don't really know what's going on. And it feels like poetry has become, to me, both as a reader and a writer, that much more necessary during, you know, the most of the pandemic. It feels essential. And
yeah, no, I agree. I could carry on chatting to both of you all evening, but we're at 8:15 now. So I think we'll wrap it up here. They were such extraordinary readings, and you've given us so much wonderful time and thinking and sound this evening. If everybody in the chat is saying thank you, they already are, and applauding. And thank you also, everybody, for staying and listening to this evening's poetry. Thank you again to Oxford Brookes and Neil for hosting. I've got to do the very horrible work of ending our session quite abruptly. So one final time, thank you so much, Sylvia. Thank you so much, Mary Jean.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.